The air sliced with a chilling sharpness as a voice, jagged and icy, pierced through the dimly lit corner store. "That chain doesn't belong to you, kid. Hand it over before I rip it off you myself." The words hit like a slap, halting Marcus Freeman mid-step. He was just a boy, barely 14, standing in the flickering glow of the store's fluorescent lights. His thin fingers instinctively clutching the delicate gold chain draped around his neck. It wasn't just jewelry to him, it was a tether to his father, Elijah Freeman, who had fastened it there on Marcus's last birthday with a smile that radiated pride. "Something to remind you of who you are," Elijah had said, his voice warm and steady. To Marcus, that chain was love, identity, a quiet promise. But to the man looming over him, a badge pinned to his chest like a medal of warped entitlement. It was nothing more than a chance to flex his dominance. Marcus's heart thudded wildly in his chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing in his ears as he lifted his gaze to meet the officer's cold, unyielding stare. "I didn't steal this, sir." "It's mine," he managed to say, his voice quivering like a leaf caught in a storm, yet laced with a stubborn resolve that surprised even him. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't a liar. He was just a kid who loved soccer, who dreamed of scoring goals, who carried his father's lessons like a shield. But the officer, Sergeant Daniel Cooper, didn't care about any of that. A smirk twisted his lips, cruel and deliberate, as he took a step closer. His heavy boots striking the tiled floor with a menacing thud that seemed to reverberate through Marcus's bones. "You people always have excuses," Cooper sneered, his tone dripping with venom. "A chain like that doesn't belong to someone like you." Before Marcus could react, the man's meaty hand shot out, snagging the chain and yanking it free with a single, brutal tug. The gasp that escaped Marcus's lips was involuntary, a sharp intake of breath as the chain, his chain, slipped from his neck. It felt like a piece of him had been torn away, leaving a raw, aching void. His wide brown eyes stared in disbelief as the officer dangled the gold between his fingers, inspecting it with a casual disdain that made Marcus's stomach churn. Around them, the handful of customers in the store, a tired woman clutching a loaf of bread, an older man counting coins at the counter, averted their gazes, their silence a heavy shroud. They saw, but they didn't see. Fear or apathy kept their heads bowed, their lips sealed, and Marcus felt the sting of their indifference like a second wound. Heat surged to his face. A scalding mix of humiliation and rage, hotter than any bruise could ever burn. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, threatening to spill, but he clamped his teeth down on his lip. The metallic taste of blood grounding him. He wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of this man who'd stripped him bare, of his chain, yes, but more painfully, of his dignity. Cooper chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. He pocketed the chain with a flick of his wrist, as if it were trash he'd picked off the floor, then leaned in close. His breath was sour. His voice a taunting whisper. "Next time, don't walk around acting like you're something you're not." The words landed like a punch, each syllable laced with a prejudice so thick it choked the air. Marcus's fists balled at his sides, his nails digging into his palms until they left crescent-shaped marks. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to lash out, to swing, to fight, but he didn't. He couldn't. His father's voice echoed in his mind, "Stay calm, Marcus. Survive. That's how we make it through, *. So he stood there, trembling with a fury he couldn't unleash. His breath hitching as the officer turned away, tossing the chain deeper into his pocket with a carelessness that made Marcus's chest tighten. But then, a shadow darkened the doorway. And the atmosphere in the store shifted, like the calm before a thunderstorm. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice wasn't loud. But it carried a gravity that seemed to still the very air. Every head swiveled toward the entrance, where a man stood framed against the gray light of the rain-soaked street beyond. He wasn't tall or imposing in stature, but there was something about him, an unshakable presence, a quiet authority that filled the room. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him like a tidal wave. It was his father, Elijah Freeman, dressed in a plain jacket and jeans, his face a mask of controlled fury. The boy's knees nearly buckled with relief, but the storm of emotions swirling inside him, anger, shame, a desperate yearning for justice, kept him rooted to the spot. Sergeant Cooper froze for a heartbeat, caught off guard by the interruption, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. He squared his shoulders, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his voice edged with irritation. "I'm doing my job. This kid was parading around with stolen property. I'm confiscating it." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but Elijah didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate. His dark eyes locked on Cooper's with an intensity that made the officer's bravado waver. "That chain isn't stolen," Elijah said, his voice low and steady, each word a hammer striking stone. "It was a gift from me. I watched you tear it off his neck." The room seemed to shrink, the tension crackling like static. Cooper's smirk faltered, his confidence fraying at the edges. But he doubled down, puffing out his chest. "Listen, you don't know who you're dealing with." "I don't have time to argue with," Elijah cut him off, his hand dipping into his jacket to pull out a badge of his own. The glint of it under the store's lights was like a thunderclap. "You're right," he said, his tone icy and unyielding. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I'm a federal agent, and you just committed robbery under the pretense of authority. Trust me, this won't end well for you." The color drained from Cooper's face, leaving him pale and hollow, but he tried to cling to his crumbling facade. "You're making a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I was just," Elijah didn't let him finish. "You were just abusing your power," he said, stepping closer until he was inches from the officer. "Humiliating a child. Acting on your own twisted bias. And now, you're going to face the consequences." The words hung heavy, a promise wrapped in steel. Marcus watched, his heart pounding, as his father's calm yet blazing resolve dismantled the officer's arrogance piece by piece. For the first time that day, a flicker of hope sparked within him, fragile but growing. Tangled with the chaos of his emotions, fury at the injustice, shame at his helplessness, and a fierce, burning need to see right prevail. Cooper's bravado melted into something closer to panic, his eyes darting around the store as if searching for an escape. The other customers, once silent spectators, now watched with rapt attention, their expressions shifting from fear to curiosity. The elderly couple behind the counter, Mr. and Mrs. Patel, who'd run the store for decades, exchanged a glance, their weathered faces tightening with disapproval. They'd known Marcus since he was small enough to toddle in with his mother, Vanessa, clinging to her hand. They'd seen him grow into a polite, bright boy. And now they saw the weight of this moment pressing down on him. Mrs. Patel's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter, while Mr. Patel's eyes narrowed, a quiet anger simmering beneath his usual gentle demeanor. I was just doing my job," Cooper sputtered, his voice a weak echo of its earlier swagger. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said, his voice cutting like a blade through the officer's excuses. "Your job is to serve and protect. What you did today was abuse and theft. And I'm going to make sure you're held accountable." The confrontation swelled, filling the small space with an electric charge that made the air feel thick and unbreathable. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes darting between his father and the officer, his mind racing. He wanted to cheer, to scream, to run to his dad and bury his face in his chest, but he stayed still, anchored by the weight of what was unfolding. Sergeant Cooper, a man who'd spent years wielding his badge like a weapon, found himself cornered, his authority unraveling like a threadbare cloth. His hands twitched at his sides, his breath coming in shallow bursts as Elijah's unwavering stare bore into him. The real storm, though, was still brewing, a reckoning that would ripple far beyond this cramped corner store. What would happen next would leave everyone who witnessed it reeling. A seismic shift that would challenge the very system that had emboldened men like Cooper to thrive unchecked. For Marcus, it was more than just the return of his chain, it was a lesson etched in fire and tears. Justice wasn't guaranteed, but it could be fought for. And for Cooper, it was a stark, terrifying truth: power, when abused, carried a price, one he'd never imagined he'd have to pay. The fallout was coming, and it would shake the ground beneath them all. The air in the corner store hung thick with tension. A suffocating stillness that seemed to coil tighter the moment Marcus stepped through the door. He was a wiry 16-year-old, his sneakers scuffing softly against the chipped linoleum floor. The gold chain around his neck glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. He'd worn it with quiet pride ever since his father had placed it in his hands 2 birthdays ago, a symbol of trust. Of love, of something earned. But to Sergeant Daniel Cooper, standing near the counter with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed, that chain told a different story. The officer didn't see Marcus. He saw a stereotype, a kid who couldn't possibly belong to something so fine. Assumptions rooted in years of prejudice flared in Cooper's mind like a spark catching dry grass. And he decided right then that Marcus didn't deserve it. Marcus, oblivious to the storm brewing in Cooper's gaze, approached the counter with a crumpled $5 bill clutched in his hand. He'd come for a soda, nothing more, his thoughts drifting to the homework waiting at home and the basketball game he'd promised his friends tomorrow. But before he could set the bottle down, Cooper moved, swift and deliberate, planting himself squarely in Marcus's path. The boy stopped short, his breath catching as the officer loomed over him, a wall of authority clad in a pressed uniform. The other customers, 2 older women browsing the aisles and a tired-looking man in a trucker hat near the register, froze. Their eyes darting toward the unfolding scene with a mix of curiosity and unease. Cooper's voice slithered out, low and menacing, cutting through the hum of the store's ancient refrigerator. "That's a real nice chain you got there, kid." He tilted his head, gesturing toward the gold links with a flick of his fingers. "Bet you didn't pay a dime for it, huh?" The accusation hung heavy, dripping with venom, and Marcus blinked, his mind scrambling to process the words. Confusion twisted into a knot of anger deep in his chest, but fear crept in alongside it, cold and insistent. His hand instinctively rose to the chain, fingers curling protectively around the warm metal as his heart thudded against his ribs. "It's mine," he said, forcing the words out. His voice steady but trembling at the edges, a fragile shield against the storm he felt building. Cooper leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. A smirk stretching across his face like a crack in a dam. "Yours, huh? Funny, I don't think I've ever seen a kid like you with something that fancy. Not unless it's stolen. Hand it over." The words weren't a request, they were a command, sharp and unyielding, laced with a certainty that made Marcus's stomach churn. Humiliation crashed over him like a wave, relentless and drowning. As he felt the weight of every gaze in the store pinning him in place. His hands shook, his throat tightened, and he looked up at Cooper, but before he could find it, the officer's hand shot forward, fingers clamping around the chain. With a single, brutal yank, he tore it free. The snap of the clasp echoing through the silence like a gunshot. Marcus gasped, his hand flying to his bare neck, the skin still warm where the chain had rested moments before. His chest heaved as panic and loss tangled together, a bitter taste rising in his throat. Cooper held the chain aloft, turning it lazily in the light as if it were some cheap trinket he'd plucked from a pawn shop. "Thought so," he muttered, his tone thick with smug satisfaction. "You don't look like someone who can afford this." The words cut deeper than the theft itself, slicing into Marcus's pride, his identity, his very sense of self. His mind spun. A chaotic whirlwind of rage and helplessness. He wanted to scream, to lunge forward and snatch the chain back, to demand justice, but the stories he'd heard. The warnings whispered by his parents and echoed in grainy phone videos online, held him back. Boys like him, black boys with fire in their eyes, didn't always walk away from men like Cooper. So he stood there, rooted to the spot, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall, the shame wrapping around him like a second skin. The bell above the door jangled sharply, shattering the suffocating quiet, and a voice sliced through the tension like a blade honed by years of resolve. "What's going on here?" Elijah Freeman stepped into the store. His broad shoulders filling the doorway, his presence a sudden anchor in the chaos. He'd been driving home from a late meeting at the FBI field office. His tie loosened in his mind on the dinner waiting for him, when he decided to swing by and surprise Marcus with a ride home. Now, his sharp brown eyes swept the scene, his son, rigid with shock. The chain missing from his neck, Cooper, standing too close, clutching the stolen gold, the onlookers, silent and staring. Elijah's heart sank, a familiar ache blooming beneath his calm exterior. But his voice remained steady, resonant with an authority that made the air itself seem to straighten. "What's going on here?" he repeated, each word deliberate, a warning wrapped in composure. Cooper turned, his smirk flickering like a candle in a draft, though he quickly masked it with a veneer of confidence. "Just doing my job," he said, his tone casual but edged with defiance. "This kid was wearing stolen property, so I confiscated it." He dangled the chain for emphasis, as if it were evidence in a trial he'd already won. Elijah's gaze shifted to Marcus, who stood frozen. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles paled. The boy's eyes met his father's, a silent plea shimmering within them, and Elijah felt a surge of fury bubble beneath his ribs, fury at Cooper. At the system that emboldened him, at the world that kept forcing his son to prove his worth. But he held it in check, stepping closer with measured steps. "That's not stolen property," he said. His voice cutting through the lie like a scalpel. "It's a gift. From me." Cooper's smirk returned, though it wavered now, a crack in his bravado. "Look, I don't know who you are." But Elijah didn't let him finish. With a fluid motion, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, holding it up so the light caught the embossed letters, FBI. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the revelation rippling outward. "I'm Special Agent Elijah Freeman," he said, his voice like tempered steel, unyielding and cold. "And what I see here is a blatant abuse of power." The dynamic shifted in an instant, the air crackling with a new energy. The older women in the aisles exchanged wide-eyed glances. Their whispers barely audible, the trucker by the register straightened, his exhaustion replaced by fascination. Marcus felt a rush of relief flood through him, mingling with pride as he watched his father face down the man who'd stripped him bare. But the moment wasn't over, not yet. Cooper's confidence crumbled, his shoulders hunching slightly. Though he tried to rally. "Listen, Agent Freeman, I was just," Elijah cut him off, his voice a razor's edge. "You were just violating my son's rights. And now you're going to answer for it." The words landed like stones, heavy and final, and for the first time, Cooper's eyes flickered with genuine doubt. What had begun as a fleeting act of cruelty was spiraling into something far larger, a reckoning that would ripple beyond this dusty store, challenging the fragile threads of power that men like Cooper clung to. Marcus watched, his chest swelling with a fragile hope. Realizing this wasn't the end but the beginning of a fight for something greater, justice, not just for him, but for all the voices silenced by the weight of unchecked authority. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet fury and reluctant compliance. Elijah demanded the chain's return, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, and Cooper, his jaw tight with resentment. Thrust it back into Marcus's trembling hands. The gold felt heavier now, tainted by the memory of its theft, a bitter reminder of the humiliation that still burned in Marcus's chest. As they drove home, the silence in the car was deafening, the hum of the engine filling the void where words failed. Marcus stared out the window, his fingers tracing the chain's links absently, trying to reclaim the pride it once held. In the driver's seat, Elijah gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind a tempest of rage and guilt. He'd spent decades clawing his way through a world that resisted him, building a life to shield his family from the scars he bore, yet here was Marcus. 16 and already marked by the same battles Elijah had fought to spare him. When they pulled into the driveway, Vanessa was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed against the evening chill. Her smile faltered as she caught the storm in her husband's eyes and the slump in her son's shoulders. Without a word, she stepped forward and enveloped Marcus in a hug. Her warmth a lifeline as he clung to her, his breath hitching with the tears he'd held back too long. Elijah lingered by the car, his jaw clenched, watching his wife cradle their son. He wanted to speak, to fix this, but the words wouldn't come, not yet. Later, at the dinner table, the tension sat among them like an uninvited guest. Marcus pushed his food around his plate, his appetite buried beneath the weight of the day, while Vanessa's gaze flitted between her husband and son, her worry a quiet pulse beneath her calm. Elijah broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "Marcus, I need to know everything. Every word, every move." Marcus hesitated, his fork stilling as the memory clawed its way back. He didn't want to relive it, the officer's sneer, the rip of the chain, the suffocating shame, but his father's steady gaze left no escape. Slowly, haltingly, he recounted it all. Each detail a splinter pulled from a wound. Vanessa's hand rested on his shoulder, a silent tether, while Elijah listened, his fists tightening beneath the table, his anger a coiled spring. When Marcus finished, the room fell quiet again, the air thick with unspoken resolve. "This isn't over," Elijah said, his tone a promise etched in stone. Vanessa frowned, her voice soft but urgent. "Elijah, what are you planning?" He shook his head, his eyes dark with purpose. "Justice. That man didn't just hurt our son, he wielded his power like a blade. He's done it before. And I'll make sure he doesn't do it again." Vanessa's brow creased, her heart torn between pride and fear. She knew Elijah's strength, his unyielding drive. But she also knew the cost of challenging a system that guarded its own. "Be careful," she whispered. "This isn't just one man, it's the whole machine behind him." Elijah nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "I know. But if we don't stand up, who will?" In the days that followed, Elijah moved with quiet determination. Pulling strings and digging into Cooper's past, every complaint, every whispered rumor, building a case not just for Marcus, but for the countless others crushed beneath the weight of unchecked power. For Marcus, the chain remained a bittersweet emblem, a reminder that justice wasn't a gift, it was a battle, one his father would fight, and one he was beginning to understand he'd inherit. The lesson sank deep, power without accountability was a thief in the night, but justice, hard-won and fierce, could light the way forward. Elijah Freeman sat hunched over his desk late into the night, the dim glow of his lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered surface. Papers littered the space, reports, complaints, and scribbled notes, all pointing to a truth he'd long suspected but hadn't wanted to fully face. What he uncovered about Sergeant Daniel Cooper didn't shock him as much as it fueled a slow, simmering rage deep in his chest. Excessive force, racial profiling, misconduct, years of it, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference. It was a portrait of a man who'd wielded his authority like a weapon, untouchable for far too long. Elijah's fingers tightened around the edge of a file, his knuckles whitening. He knew he had to move cautiously. His role in the FBI granted him rare access to this kind of dirt, but it also painted a target on his back. One wrong move, one slip. And it wouldn't just be his career on the line, his wife, Vanessa, and their son, Marcus, could pay the price. The thought gnawed at him. A quiet dread that kept him awake as the clock ticked past midnight. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus trudged through the fluorescent-lit hallways of his high school. His sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. The air buzzed with whispers that trailed him like a shadow, some hushed, some bold enough to sting. Classmates darted glances his way. A few avoided him entirely, their eyes dropping to the ground as if he carried something contagious. Others stumbled over clumsy attempts at kindness. Their words landing like stones in the pit of his stomach. "Hey, man, you okay?" they'd mumble, shifting awkwardly before hurrying off. To Marcus. It felt as though the incident at the corner store had stripped him bare, turning him into a walking headline instead of a 17-year-old kid who just wanted to blend in. The chain around his neck, a gift from his grandmother, simple and silver, pressed against his skin, heavier than it had ever been. Each time it shifted, he saw Cooper's sneer, heard the barked orders. Felt the cold grip of fear that had pinned him in place that day. He tugged his hoodie tighter, trying to shrink into himself, but there was no escaping it. One crisp afternoon. After soccer practice, Marcus lingered on the bleachers, the field emptying out as his teammates' laughter faded into the distance. The sky burned orange and pink, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the grass. He sat alone, knees pulled up, staring at the scuffed toes of his cleats. His chest felt tight, like something was clawing to get out. But he didn't know how to let it. Footsteps crunched behind him, deliberate and steady, and he glanced up to see Coach Harris approaching. The man was a fixture at the school, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from years of discipline and quiet compassion. He'd always seen something in Marcus, pushing him harder on the field than anyone else, not out of cruelty but belief. Now. He lowered himself onto the bleacher beside Marcus, the wood creaking under his weight. "You've been quiet lately, kid," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the evening chill. "Something's off. You wanna talk?" Marcus froze, his throat closing up. He wanted to spill it all, the anger, the humiliation. The way he couldn't sleep without seeing Cooper's face, but the words stuck like glue. He shook his head, muttering, "It's nothing. Just stuff." Coach Harris didn't buy it. His eyes, sharp and knowing, lingered on Marcus for a beat too long. "I've been around the block, son. I can tell when something's eating at a guy. You don't have to lay it all out for me. But don't lock it up inside, either. You've got people in your corner." Marcus swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat. He managed a nod and a hoarse "thanks," then grabbed his bag and bolted. The horizon swallowing the last sliver of sunlight as he left the field behind. Back at home, Elijah's investigation was picking up steam, a storm brewing in the Freeman dining room. He'd spread his findings across the table, photographs, sworn statements, timelines, a dossier that could bury Cooper if it landed in the right hands. Each page told a story. A mother harassed in her own driveway, a teenager roughed up for no reason, a shopkeeper intimidated into silence. But the deeper Elijah dug, the uglier it got. Cooper wasn't a lone wolf. He was a cog in a machine, shielded by colleagues who shrugged off his brutality and superiors who signed off on the cover-ups. It was a rotting system, built on quiet nods and turned backs. And Elijah felt the weight of it pressing down on him. That night, he showed it all to Vanessa. She stood across from him, her arms crossed, her dark eyes scanning the papers as he explained. Her face hardened with every detail, shock giving way to a fury that trembled in her voice. "This isn't just Cooper," she said, her fingers gripping the edge of a witness statement. This is so much bigger than one man. Elijah's jaw tightened, his nod slow and deliberate. I know. But he's the starting point. If we can bring him down, we can unravel the rest. Vanessa's gaze flicked to him, worry etching lines into her brow. Elijah, this is dangerous. You're not just fighting a person, you're challenging a whole institution. Promise me you'll watch your back. He reached for her hand, his voice steady but hollow. I promise. In his heart, though, he wasn't sure. Justice was a fire in his veins now. And he'd burn everything down to see it through. The tension in their home thickened, a silent hum that followed them from room to room. Elijah couldn't shake the drive consuming him, even as it pulled him tighter along a razor's edge. Marcus, meanwhile, wrestled with a storm of his own. He admired his dad's grit, the way he refused to let Cooper walk free. But fear gnawed at him too. What if this fight swallowed them all? Across town, Cooper was starting to fray. The swagger he'd carried after pinning Marcus at the store was crumbling, replaced by a twitchy unease. Rumors of an investigation swirled through the precinct, faint but persistent, like flies he couldn't swat away. He'd underestimated the Freemans, Elijah's quiet resolve, Marcus's stubborn endurance, and now, for the first time, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. His armor, once impenetrable, was cracking, and he didn't know how to stop it. But the real reckoning was still brewing. What Elijah had unearthed was just the tip of a dark, sprawling iceberg, and his next moves would ignite a showdown no one saw coming, least of all Cooper. One evening, in a dimly lit meeting room at the FBI field office, the air hung heavy with the buzz of flickering fluorescent lights. Elijah sat at the head of a long table, his laptop glowing faintly. Stacks of evidence fanned out before him like a war map. Across from him was Special Agent Linda Graves, his supervisor, a woman with steel in her spine and a reputation for cutting through bullshit. Her short-cropped hair framed a face that rarely softened, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail as she flipped through Elijah's files. She'd seen a lot in her 20 years on the job. But this was a beast. Her brow creased deeper with each page, her silence stretching until it felt like the room might crack. Finally, she spoke, her voice even but heavy. This is airtight. Elijah. Cooper's pattern is clear as day. The question is, what's your endgame? Elijah met her gaze, unflinching. Accountability. Not just for him, but for every cop who let him run wild. Every boss who pretended not to see. People like my son deserve that much. Linda leaned back, exhaling through her nose. You're not talking about one bad apple here. You're talking about cracking open a whole damn orchard. That's gonna piss people off, powerful people. You sure you're ready for the heat? Elijah didn't blink. I'm ready. This isn't just about my family anymore. It's about every kid, every parent, every soul Cooper and his kind have crushed. Linda studied him, her piercing eyes hunting for doubt. Finding none. She gave a curt nod. All right. I'm in. But we play this clean, no slip-ups, no cutting corners. If we're taking on a machine this big, every move's gotta be bulletproof. Relief washed through Elijah, tempered by the mountain ahead. Understood. Let's do it. The days that followed blurred into a frenzy, late-night strategy sessions, hushed phone calls, pages of notes piling up. Elijah and Linda handpicked a tight-knit team, choosing agents who burned with the same hunger for justice. They knew the stakes, they were waging war on a system that protected its own. A web of loyalty and silence that stretched far beyond Cooper. But the urgency left no room for second-guessing. Meanwhile, Cooper's world was tilting. His once assured stride faltered as he walked the precinct halls, his eyes flicking nervously to every corner. The whispers had grown louder, the stares sharper. He'd caught wind of an FBI probe. But no one had confronted him yet, and the not knowing ate at him, twisting into a paranoia he couldn't shake. His palms sweated, his temper flared at the smallest things, a spilled coffee, a rookie's question, and he felt the walls closing in. It all crashed down on a chilly Thursday morning. Cooper was summoned to a meeting with Captain Harris, the precinct's internal affairs officer, a wiry man with a poker face that revealed nothing. As Cooper stepped into the room, his gut twisted. There, seated at the table, were Harris, 2 FBI agents, and Elijah Freeman, his presence a quiet thunderclap. Cooper's jaw locked, his eyes narrowing as they met Elijah's unyielding stare. "What's this about?" he asked, forcing a breezy tone that cracked at the edges. Harris motioned to a chair. "Sit down, Sergeant." Cooper hesitated, then sank into the seat, his fingers digging into the table's edge. One of the agents, a woman with a cool, measured air, began laying out the case: victim complaints, witness accounts, recovered body cam footage that had mysteriously vanished before resurfacing. Each word landed like a sledgehammer, chipping away at Cooper's composure. His face flushed, his breathing quickened, until he couldn't hold it in. "This is bullshit," he exploded, his voice bouncing off the walls. "You're trusting lowlifes over me? I've put years into this community." Elijah's response was a blade, calm but razor-sharp. "You didn't serve the community. You preyed on it. You hid behind your badge to bully, to rob, to break people who couldn't hit back. But that ends now. You're done running from the consequences." Cooper's bravado flickered, his glare venomous but unsteady. "And who the hell are you to judge me? Just another suit with a grudge." The room went still, the weight of Elijah's words hanging in the air. Justice wasn't just a word here, it was a promise, a reckoning for every life Cooper had scarred. And as the evidence tightened around him, Cooper felt the lesson sinking in: power, when twisted, always comes with a price. For the Freemans, though, the fight was far from over. They'd braced for this storm, but the cost, oh, the cost, was still a shadow lurking just out of sight, waiting to reveal itself. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Elijah leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Cooper with an intensity that could pierce steel. His voice, steady yet brimming with restrained fury, cut through the silence like a blade. "I'm a father," he began, each word deliberate, heavy with the weight of years spent protecting his own. "A father who had to stand by and watch you rip every shred of dignity from my son, all because you thought your badge gave you a free pass to do whatever you damn well pleased." His gaze never faltered, pinning Cooper to his seat. "And I'm an agent, one who's spent decades chasing down people just like you, people who twist the trust they're given into a weapon." The room seemed to shrink under the force of his words, a suffocating stillness settling over everyone present. Cooper, once brimming with smug assurance, shifted in his chair, his fingers twitching nervously as the confidence drained from his face like water from a cracked glass. The FBI agents in the room pressed forward with their case, their voices calm but relentless. Each piece of evidence landing like a hammer strike. Photographs, recordings, witness statements, they piled up, an unyielding wall of truth that boxed Cooper in. With every new revelation, his bravado crumbled further, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of his own choices was finally catching up to him. By the time the agents concluded, the man who had once strutted through the precinct with an air of untouchability sat hollowed out, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. But the reckoning didn't stop with him. The investigation had clawed deeper, unearthing a tangled network of complicity that stretched far beyond one corrupt officer. There were others, fellow officers who had turned a blind eye, supervisors who had dismissed complaints with a wave of their hand, an entire culture of silence that had festered within the precinct, allowing Cooper's arrogance to flourish unchecked. This wasn't just about one man's fall, it was about a system that had propped him up, shielding him from the consequences of his actions. As the meeting drew to a close, Elijah rose to his feet, his presence commanding the room despite the exhaustion tugging at the edges of his frame. His voice rang out, steady and resolute. "This isn't just about one person's crimes," he said, his eyes sweeping across the faces before him, some ashamed, some defiant. "It's about holding an entire system accountable for letting men like him thrive. And that accountability starts right here, right now." The words lingered in the air. A call to action that no one could ignore. Moments later, Cooper was led out of the precinct, his wrists bound by the cold bite of handcuffs. The badge that had once been his shield now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the stark reality of justice closing in. As he shuffled past his colleagues, the silence was deafening, a heavy, unspoken judgment. Some averted their eyes, their faces flushed with guilt for having stood by him too long. Others watched with quiet satisfaction. A flicker of relief in their expressions as they saw a man who had tarnished their department finally face the music. Back at home, Marcus sat on the edge of the couch. His eyes fixed on the flickering television screen as news anchors recounted Cooper's arrest in clipped, dramatic tones. A storm of emotions churned within him, relief that the nightmare might finally be over, pride in his father's unwavering resolve, and a lingering ache that something so personal had been laid bare for the world to see. Vanessa settled beside him, her presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. She rested a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch warm and steadying. "Your dad did this for you," she said softly, her voice a soothing balm against the raw edges of his thoughts. "For all of us." Marcus nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. He understood now that his father's fight stretched beyond their family's pain, it was a stand against a tide of injustice. A promise that no one else would have to endure what he had. That evening, Elijah trudged through the front door, his shoulders sagging under the burden of the day. The lines on his face told a story of sleepless nights and unrelenting determination, but when his gaze landed on Marcus, something shifted. The tension that had gripped him melted away, replaced by a quiet warmth. Marcus stood, the gold chain around his neck catching the soft glow of the living room lamp, a small symbol of resilience amid the storm. Without a word, he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around his father, the embrace tight and unyielding. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion he couldn't fully name. Elijah's hand came to rest on his son's back, steady despite the lump rising in his throat. "Always," he replied, the single word carrying a lifetime of promises. In that moment, the walls of their home seemed to hum with the echoes of their victory, but both knew it was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite a larger battle for justice in their community. Later that night, the house fell silent, Vanessa and Marcus retreating to their rooms as the clock ticked past midnight. Elijah sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in his hands. The stillness was a stark contrast to the chaos of the day, but his mind refused to quiet. Images flashed behind his eyes, Cooper's smug grin dissolving into defeat, the stack of evidence piling higher, the faces of those who had enabled him. Satisfaction mingled with unease. A bitter cocktail he couldn't shake. This wasn't just about one man's downfall, it was about dismantling something far uglier, a rot that had taken root deep within the system. Today had been a win. Yes, but Elijah knew it was a single step on a treacherous path, a path that demanded more than he'd ever imagined. A faint creak from the stairs broke his reverie. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the hallway light, his gold chain glinting like a quiet beacon. He hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, then stepped forward and slid into the chair across from his father. Elijah studied him, noting the tension still etched into his son's frame, the way his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible load. "I couldn't sleep," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, fragile in the stillness. Every time I close my eyes. It's there, what he said, what he did. It's like it's stuck, replaying over and over. Elijah set his coffee down, leaning forward with a gentleness that belied the steel in his gaze. I know. He said quietly, his tone steady but laced with understanding. I've been there. That feeling, it doesn't just vanish. But you're stronger than he'll ever be, Marcus. What he tried to take from you, he didn't get. You're still here. Marcus swallowed hard, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve, twisting the fabric as if it could anchor him. It doesn't feel like winning, he murmured. His voice raw. It feels heavy, like I can't shake it off. Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face, the weight of his son's words settling into his bones. It's okay to feel that, he said. His voice softening. What happened to you, it wasn't fair, wasn't right. But don't let him keep that power over you. You win by moving forward, by living your life on your terms, not his. The words hung between them, a lifeline tossed across a churning sea. Marcus nodded slowly, though doubt still shadowed his eyes. Did you ever feel like this? He asked, his voice trembling. Like the anger was too much? Elijah's expression softened, a flicker of memory crossing his face as he leaned back, crossing his arms. Every day when I was your age, he said. His tone quiet but firm. The things I saw, the way people looked at me, like I didn't belong, like I'd never be enough, it stuck with me. Ate at me for years. But then I figured it out. Anger doesn't have to swallow you whole. It can fuel you, push you to fight smarter, to make a difference that lasts. Marcus's fingers brushed the chain around his neck. A subconscious gesture as he absorbed his father's words. I want to be like you, he said, his voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the air. Strong like you. Elijah reached across the table. His hand resting on Marcus's, steady and sure. You already are, he said, his eyes locking with his son's. Don't you ever forget that. The moment stretched. A quiet bond weaving through the silence, until Marcus finally stood, his shoulders a fraction lighter than before. Thanks, Dad, he murmured, then turned and slipped back upstairs. Elijah watched him go, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that better than anyone, but tonight had been a small victory, a step toward healing. By morning, the Freeman household buzzed with restless energy. News of Cooper's arrest had spread like wildfire, the story splashed across every channel and headline. Vanessa stood in the living room. Her phone pressed to her ear as she navigated a flood of calls, friends offering support, colleagues digging for details. Marcus perched on the couch, scrolling through his tablet. The endless stream of articles both a comfort and a burden. Elijah lingered in the kitchen, poring over notes for a press conference later that day. His pen scratching against paper as he braced for the storm ahead. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the hum of activity, and Vanessa opened it to reveal Linda Graves standing on the porch. Her face a mask of guarded resolve. Elijah stepped forward, his brow furrowing as he took in her tense posture. Linda, he greeted, his voice cautious, sensing the weight she carried. What's going on? Linda stepped inside, her eyes flicking briefly to Marcus before settling on Elijah. We need to talk, she said, her tone low, urgent. Privately. He nodded. Leading her into his small office and shutting the door with a soft click. She didn't waste a breath, placing a thick folder on his desk with a thud that seemed to echo. There's been a development, she said, her voice steady but laced with unease. We've uncovered more connections, more people who helped cover for Cooper. But it's bigger than we thought. Some of these names, she tapped the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. They're not just local. This goes way up the chain. Elijah opened the folder. His eyes scanning the list of names, officers, administrators, even a few city officials. His jaw tightened as the scope of it sank in, the implications sprawling like cracks in a dam. This isn't just the precinct, he said, his voice grim, almost a growl. This is systemic. Linda nodded, her expression mirroring his. Exactly. And if we push this further, we need to be ready. This won't just stir the pot, it'll blow the lid off everything. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as the enormity of the fight crystallized before him. He'd known from the start that justice wouldn't come cheap, but this was a beast of a different scale. We can't stop now, he said, his resolve hardening like iron. Not when we're this close. The lesson was clear, justice wasn't just a gavel strike or a pair of handcuffs snapping shut. It was a relentless pursuit. A battle against the shadows of power that thrived on silence and complicity. Cooper's fall was a warning, a stark reminder that abusing authority carried a price. One that rippled far beyond the individual. For Elijah, Marcus, and even Linda, the fight was no longer just personal, it was a reckoning for a system that had failed too many for too long. And as the stakes rose, so did their determination to see it through, no matter the cost. In the stillness of a tense, dimly lit room, Elijah leaned forward, his posture rigid. His eyes locked onto Cooper with an intensity that could pierce steel. His voice trembled not with fear but with the raw, unfiltered fury of a father who had witnessed his son's dignity torn apart by someone who believed power granted them immunity. "I'm a father," he said, each word deliberate. Heavy with the weight of sleepless nights and unspoken pain, a father who had to watch you strip away everything my son held dear, all because you thought no one would dare stop you. His gaze didn't falter, and the air grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves absorbed the gravity of his accusation. "And I'm an agent," he continued. His tone shifting to the steely resolve of a man who'd spent decades chasing shadows. "Who's dedicated my entire life to hunting down people like you, people who twist the trust they're given into a weapon." The room fell into a silence so profound it seemed to hum. Every soul present feeling the crushing burden of Elijah's words settle over them like a storm cloud ready to break. Cooper, seated across the table, squirmed in his chair. His once cocksure demeanor dissolving like mist under a harsh sun. His fingers twitched nervously, betraying the bravado he'd worn like armor only moments before. The FBI agents, methodical and unrelenting, pressed forward with their case, laying out evidence piece by damning piece, photographs, audio recordings, witness statements, each one a hammer strike. Driving nails deeper into the coffin of Cooper's crumbling empire. By the time they concluded, the arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated slump. His eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. But the reckoning didn't stop with him. The investigation had peeled back layers of rot within the precinct, revealing a tangled web of complicity, officers who'd turned blind eyes, supervisors who'd dismissed complaints with a shrug. A pervasive culture of silence that had nurtured Cooper's corruption like a weed in fertile soil. This wasn't just one man's downfall, it was a mirror held up to a system that had shielded him. A lesson in the consequences of unchecked power that reverberated far beyond the room. As the meeting drew to a close, Elijah rose to his feet. His broad shoulders squared despite the exhaustion tugging at his frame. His voice cut through the stillness, steady and commanding, carrying the weight of a vow. "This isn't just about one man," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, meeting every gaze with unflinching determination. "It's about holding an entire system accountable, tearing down the structures that let men like him thrive. And it starts right here, right now." The words hung in the air, a clarion call to justice that left no room for ambiguity. Moments later, Cooper was led from the precinct, wrists bound in cold, unforgiving handcuffs. The badge that had once been his shield now felt like a distant memory, its weight replaced by the stark reality of consequence. As he shuffled past his former colleagues, the silence was deafening. Some averted their eyes, shame etching lines into their faces, while others watched with quiet satisfaction. A flicker of relief in their expressions as justice finally sank its teeth into a man who'd stained their department's honor. At home, Marcus sat on the worn leather couch, the television casting a flickering glow across his face as news anchors recounted Cooper's arrest in clipped, dramatic tones. His emotions churned like a restless sea, relief that the nightmare might finally end, pride in his father's unwavering fight, and a lingering sadness that something so personal had been laid bare for the world to dissect. Vanessa, his mother, settled beside him, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. She rested a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and steady, and murmured, "Your dad did this for you, Marcus, for you and for all of us." Her voice was soft, but it carried a depth of conviction that made Marcus pause. He nodded slowly, the truth of her words sinking into his bones. This wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about ensuring no one else would have to endure the same violation, the same betrayal of trust. The realization settled over him, heavy but grounding. A testament to the broader fight his father had taken up. Later that evening, Elijah trudged through the front door, his face etched with the weariness of a man who'd carried too much for too long. The day had drained him, hours of interrogations, evidence reviews, and the unrelenting pressure of confronting a system he'd once believed in. But when his eyes met Marcus's, standing there in the warm glow of the living room, the tension in his shoulders eased, melting away like snow under a tentative spring sun. Marcus stepped forward, his gold chain catching the light in a faint shimmer, and without a word, he enveloped his father in a hug. His arms tightened, conveying everything he couldn't yet say: gratitude, admiration, a son's quiet awe. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with emotion he fought to contain. Elijah's hand found his son's back, resting there with a reassuring weight. "Always," he replied, his own voice steady despite the tide of feeling threatening to spill over. In that embrace, something shifted, a silent promise that this victory, however small, was the spark of something greater, a ripple that would stretch far beyond their home. The night stretched on, and in the quiet of the kitchen, Elijah sat alone, a mug of coffee cooling untouched in his hands. The house was still, Vanessa and Marcus long since retreated to bed, but sleep eluded him. His mind replayed the day in vivid, relentless detail: Cooper's pale face as the cuffs clicked shut, the murmurs of the precinct, the weight of every eye on him as he'd spoken. Satisfaction flickered within him, but it was tempered by a gnawing unease. This wasn't just about Cooper, it never had been. The real enemy was bigger, more insidious, a system that rewarded silence, that buried complaints under layers of bureaucracy, that let power corrupt without consequence. Today had been a step, a crack in the foundation, but Elijah knew the war was far from won. The faint creak of the stairs jolted him from his reverie, and he looked up to see Marcus in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the soft kitchen light, his gold chain glinting faintly. The boy hesitated, then crossed the room and slid into the chair opposite his father, his shoulders still tight with unspoken burdens. "I couldn't sleep," Marcus admitted, his voice low, almost lost in the quiet. "Every time I close my eyes, it's all there, what he said, what he did. It's like it's stuck, playing over and over." His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. A nervous tick Elijah recognized from his own youth. Elijah set his mug down, leaning forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I know," he said softly, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "I've been there, Marcus. That feeling, it doesn't vanish in a night. But you're stronger than he'll ever be. What he tried to take from you, he didn't get. You're still here, still standing. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he fought the heaviness in his chest. "It doesn't feel like a win," he murmured, his eyes dropping to the table. "It feels heavy. Like I can't shake it off." Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face, the lines of exhaustion deepening. "It's okay to feel that," he said. "What happened to you wasn't fair, wasn't right. But don't let him keep that power over you. You win by living, by choosing your path, not his." The words lingered between them, thick with meaning, and Marcus nodded slowly, though doubt still shadowed his gaze. "Did you ever feel like that?" he asked, his voice tentative. "Like the anger was too much?" Elijah's expression softened, a rare vulnerability creeping in as he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Every day when I was your age," he admitted. "The things I saw, the way people looked at me, like I didn't belong. Like I'd never be enough, it stuck with me. But I learned something: anger doesn't have to eat you alive. It can fuel you, push you to fight for what's right, to be better than they expect." Marcus's fingers brushed the chain around his neck, a subconscious anchor. "I want to be like you," he said, his voice a whisper, fragile but resolute. "I want to be strong." Elijah reached across the table, his hand resting on his son's, firm and grounding. "You already are," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Don't ever forget that." The moment stretched, a quiet understanding passing between them, until Marcus rose, his shoulders a fraction lighter, and murmured a soft, "Thanks, Dad," before retreating upstairs. The next morning, the Freeman household buzzed with restless energy. News of Cooper's arrest had spread like wildfire, igniting headlines and whispered conversations across the city. Vanessa stood in the living room, phone pressed to her ear, her voice a calm counterpoint to the flurry of questions from friends and colleagues. Marcus sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his tablet. Each article a reminder of the storm they'd weathered. Elijah, in the kitchen, pored over notes for a press conference later that day, his brow furrowed with focus. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the hum, and Vanessa opened it to reveal Linda Graves, a precinct veteran whose sharp eyes and unreadable expression belied the weight she carried. Elijah stepped forward, his posture tensing as he greeted her. "Linda," he said cautiously, sensing the undercurrent in her presence. "What's going on?" She stepped inside, her gaze flickering briefly to Marcus before settling on Elijah. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low, urgent. "Privately." In the cramped office, door shut tight, Linda didn't waste a breath. She slapped a folder onto the desk, her movements brisk, decisive. "There's been a development," she said, her tone clipped. "We've uncovered more connections, more people who covered for Cooper. But it's bigger than we thought. Some of these names, they're not just local. This goes higher than we imagined." Elijah opened the folder, his eyes scanning the list. Each name a jolt to his system. His jaw tightened as the scope of it sank in: chiefs, officials, a network of complicity stretching far beyond the precinct's walls. "This isn't just about our station," he said, his voice grim, edged with realization. "This is systemic, rotten to the core." Linda nodded, her expression hard. "Exactly. And if we push this further, we're not just stirring the pot, we're blowing the lid off. You ready for that fallout?" Elijah leaned back, his mind racing, the enormity of the fight looming like a shadow over everything he'd built. He'd known from the start that justice wouldn't come cheap, but this was a beast of its own. "We can't stop now," he said finally, his resolve unshaken. "Not when we're this close." The lesson was clear: power, when abused, bred corruption, and justice demanded not just punishment, but a reckoning that shook the foundations to their core. In the Freeman household, the kitchen was a dimly lit sanctuary where Elijah sat hunched over the table, papers scattered like fallen leaves across its worn wooden surface. His brow furrowed deeply. A map of exhaustion and resolve etched into his face as he rubbed his temples with calloused fingers. The investigation he'd thrown himself into had grown heavier with each passing day. Its burden pressing down on his shoulders like a storm cloud that refused to break. The past few weeks had unraveled truths so staggering they left him reeling, secrets that stretched far beyond Daniel Cooper, the man who'd once seemed the sole architect of their troubles. Now, Elijah saw the sprawling network of corruption for what it was, a monstrous system that had nurtured men like Cooper, shielding them while they preyed on the vulnerable. Every new discovery pulled him deeper into its tangled depths, and though his spirit burned with purpose, his body ached under the strain. A faint creak from the floorboards snapped him out of his thoughts. He glanced up, eyes weary but alert, to find Vanessa framed in the doorway. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Her posture rigid with worry she couldn't hide. The lines on her face told a story of sleepless nights and unspoken fears, but her gaze held a steady warmth as she stepped forward. With a quiet scrape, she pulled out a chair and settled across from him, the space between them thick with unspoken words. For a long moment, they simply sat there. The silence humming with the weight of everything they'd endured. Then, Vanessa reached out, her hand finding his, her touch tentative yet firm, like an anchor in a churning sea. "You're carrying too much, Eli," she said, her voice soft but threaded with a fierce resolve that made his chest tighten. "This isn't something you can shoulder by yourself." Elijah met her eyes. And for a fleeting second, the hard edges of his expression softened, revealing the man beneath the mission. "I know," he murmured, his voice low and rough. As if the admission cost him something precious. "But it's like, if I stop, even for a breath, everything we've fought for could just collapse. All of it, gone." Vanessa's grip tightened. Her fingers pressing into his skin with quiet insistence. "You're not alone in this, Eli," she countered, her tone unwavering. "Look at what's happening out there. The community's waking up, people are finding their courage, speaking out. Marcus is stepping into his own strength. This isn't just your battle anymore, it belongs to all of us." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline he wanted desperately to grasp. Elijah leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight as he let out a long, shuddering breath. He yearned to trust her, to believe that the fire they'd ignited could burn on its own. But the threats were growing sharper, anonymous calls in the dead of night. Cryptic warnings from faceless voices who wanted the investigation buried. He'd faced danger before, but this was different. This was a blade pressed against the lives of those he loved most. "I just don't want to drag you or Marcus into the crosshairs," he said at last, guilt lacing his words like a bitter aftertaste. "This fight, it's ballooned into something I never saw coming." Vanessa's face hardened, her eyes flashing with a defiance that made her seem taller, stronger. "We're in this together, Eli. You don't get to shut us out and play the lone hero. Marcus is watching you, he's learning what it means to stand tall, even when the ground's shaking beneath you. He needs to see that justice is worth the cost." Her words struck deep, loosening the knot of tension in his chest just enough to let him breathe. Elijah nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're right," he said, his voice steadier now. "You always are." Vanessa's lips curved into a gentle smile, her hand lingering on his. "Get some rest, Eli," she urged, her tone softening. "The fight's not going anywhere, it'll be waiting for you tomorrow." He watched her rise and slip out of the room, her footsteps fading into the quiet of the house. Despite the heaviness clinging to him, that small smile lingered. She was his compass, always pointing him back to solid ground. The next morning arrived with a jolt, Linda's voice crackling through the phone before the sun had fully risen. "We've got movement," she said, her tone clipped and urgent, cutting through the haze of Elijah's restless sleep. Cooper's attorney reached out. "HEK's ready to flip, testify for a lighter sentence." Elijah sat up. Adrenaline surging through his veins like wildfire. "What's he bringing to the table?" he demanded, already reaching for his notebook. "Names, details, evidence," Linda replied. Her words sharp with triumph. "He's prepared to topple the whole rotten structure." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles whitened. "Then let's make it happen," he said. His voice a low growl of determination. The hours that followed were a chaotic blur, meetings stacked on top of meetings. Tense negotiations unfolding in cramped offices thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. Cooper's testimony hit like a thunderclap, exposing not just his inner circle but a roster of high-ranking officials who'd spent years averting their eyes from his crimes. It was the breakthrough Elijah had been chasing. A crack in the wall wide enough to let the truth pour through. But it came with a shadow. Cooper was a double-edged sword. A key witness whose cooperation made him both invaluable and dangerously unpredictable. His confessions painted a chilling portrait of a department drowning in corruption. A place where power had festered unchecked for far too long. The press descended like vultures, their questions relentless as the story erupted into a national firestorm. Elijah stood firm under their barrage, his answers clipped and factual, but inside, he felt the storm raging. Every headline, every camera flash, pulled him deeper into a spotlight he'd never sought. At home, Marcus watched it all unfold on the flickering TV screen, his young face shadowed with unease. He'd always seen his father as a pillar of unshakable strength, but now, beneath the glare of public scrutiny, he glimpsed the cracks, the toll it took on Elijah to hold that weight. One evening, as the living room glowed with the soft hum of the news, Marcus broke the silence. "Dad," he began, his voice hesitant, "do you ever regret it? Taking all this on?" Elijah turned to his son, his eyes softening as he searched Marcus's face. "Regret it? No," he said thoughtfully, leaning forward. "There are days when it feels like too much, sure. But standing up for what's right? I could never regret that." "What about you?" Marcus faltered, his gaze dropping to the carpet. "Sometimes I wish it never happened," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I didn't have to think about it all the time." Elijah's heart clenched. But he kept his tone gentle. "I know it's heavy, Marcus. I'd give anything to lift that off you. But what you've done, speaking out, being brave, that's more than most people manage in a lifetime. I'm so proud of you." Marcus looked up, his father's words sinking into him like rain into parched earth. "Thanks," he said quietly, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "I'm proud of you too." The days that followed were a whirlwind of depositions and late-night strategy sessions, the air thick with the anticipation of the looming trial. Cooper's testimony became the cornerstone of their case, a damning thread that tied together the evidence Elijah's team had painstakingly gathered. But it also laid bare the staggering depth of the corruption, a sprawling list of names that grew longer with each revelation, pulling the investigation into uncharted territory. Outside, the backlash swelled. Protesters clogged the streets around the courthouse, their voices clashing in a cacophony of support and outrage. Some held signs praising the push for justice. Others shouted accusations of betrayal, their anger fueled by fear of what the truth might unravel. The community stood divided, teetering on the edge of something seismic. For Elijah, the stakes towered higher than ever. The trial wasn't just about Cooper anymore, it was a reckoning for the entire system, a chance to prove that no one was above accountability. But it was also a tightrope, one misstep, and the fragile progress they'd clawed for could crumble. The night before the trial, he sat alone in his office. The room cloaked in shadows as papers and case files sprawled across his desk. The weight of tomorrow pressed down on him, a quiet dread coiling in his gut. Vanessa found him there. Her presence a soft intrusion on his solitude. She didn't speak at first, just sank into the chair beside him and rested a hand on his arm, her touch a silent promise. "You've done everything you can," she said at last, her voice a soothing balm. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already changed things." Elijah's throat tightened, but he nodded. "I just want it to mean something," he rasped. His eyes fixed on the desk. "For Marcus, for everyone this system's crushed." Vanessa squeezed his arm, her grip steady. "It already does. You've shown people what's possible, that's more than most ever dream of." He turned to her, gratitude and love brimming in his gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, "for always being my rock." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Always," she murmured, and in that moment, the darkness felt a little less suffocating. The trial dawned with a courtroom buzzing like a hive on the brink of collapse. Journalists jostled for space, their pens poised like weapons, while community members and stony-faced officials packed the benches. Elijah sat at the prosecution's table, his focus a blade honed sharp as the evidence unfolded and Cooper took the stand. The air crackled with tension, every word reverberating with the echoes of years of buried wrongs. Outside, the city pulsed with unrest, protesters' chants clashing in the distance. A symphony of hope and fury. Inside, the proceedings laid bare a truth far bigger than one man. This was a system dragged into the light, a community daring to demand more. A family bound by unshakable resolve. What unfolded in that room would ripple far beyond the Freemans, shaping a future still unwritten. As the trial barreled toward its climax, one truth rang clear. The fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint. But Elijah, Vanessa, and Marcus stood ready, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Unwavering in their pursuit of a world where power answered to the people it served. The lesson was stark and searing: abuse of authority sowed its own downfall, and justice, though slow, was an unstoppable tide. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with the gravity of revelations that had begun to unravel like a frayed thread pulled too tight. Cooper sat rigid at the defendant's table, his shoulders squared in a posture that screamed defiance, though his eyes betrayed flickers of unease he couldn't quite suppress. His attorney, Grant Holloway, perched beside him, exuded an air of polished composure, his tailored suit crisp and his movements deliberate. Yet, beneath that practiced calm, there were telltale signs of strain, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers tightened around his pen as the case crumbled beneath him. Defending Cooper was no small feat. The man's actions had cast a shadow over the department, a blemish so dark it seemed to seep into the very walls of the room. Cooper's face remained a mask of stone as the procession of witnesses took the stand, each one peeling back another layer of the facade he'd spent years crafting. Their voices carried the weight of lived nightmares, tales of harassment that left scars, intimidation that silenced, and abuse that shattered trust. Every word landed like a hammer strike, chipping away at the armor of invincibility he'd worn so proudly. For Cooper, this was no longer just a trial, it was a reckoning, a slow descent into the consequences he'd evaded for far too long. Across the room, Elijah Freeman sat with a quiet intensity, his dark eyes fixed on the proceedings. His chest tightened as a young woman named Alicia stepped forward. Her presence fragile yet resolute. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the stand, but her voice held steady, cutting through the stillness like a beacon. She spoke of a night that had etched itself into her memory, a routine walk home from work turned into a nightmare when Cooper stopped her. He'd accused her of theft, his tone dripping with disdain, offering no evidence beyond his own suspicion. In front of her neighbors, he'd humiliated her, his words sharp and his authority wielded like a weapon. Her voice faltered only once, breaking as she described the terror that had gripped her, the suffocating realization that no one would stand for her, that her cries would dissolve into the night air, unheard. "Why didn't you file a complaint?" Holloway snapped, his voice edged with a calculated sharpness meant to undermine her. Alicia's gaze hardened, her jaw tightening as she met his eyes. "Because I knew it wouldn't change a thing," she said, her words slicing through the room. "People like me don't get justice when it's our word against a badge." The silence that followed was deafening, her truth reverberating off the walls, a blade of clarity in a fog of denial. Elijah's fists clenched beneath the table, his knuckles widening as her pain echoed within him. It was a sorrow he knew too well, a wound he'd spent his life trying to heal, a battle he'd fought to shield his own family from. Yet here they were, caught in the same storm. When the court recessed, Elijah slipped outside, desperate for a breath of air to steady his racing thoughts. The late afternoon breeze brushed against his skin, cool and fleeting, while the distant hum of protesters buzzed like a heartbeat beyond the courthouse steps. His son Marcus joined him. His hands buried deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. They stood side by side in a silence thick with unspoken questions. The kind that lingered between a father and son bound by shared struggle. Finally, Marcus broke the quiet, his voice tentative, almost fragile. "Do you think they'll believe her?" Elijah turned to him, his expression softening with a thoughtful gravity. "They should," he said, pausing as he weighed his next words. "But what matters more is that she stood up there and spoke her truth. That's where it begins, Marcus. Change starts with courage like hers." Marcus nodded, but his brow remained furrowed. His eyes clouded with doubt. "What if it's not enough?" he pressed, his voice trembling with a fear he couldn't shake. "What if nothing changes?" Elijah rested a hand on his son's shoulder. His grip firm yet tender, a silent promise. "Change is slow, son. It's messy, frustrating, and it doesn't always look like we expect. But every step counts, no matter how small it feels." Marcus lifted his gaze, searching his father's face for something solid to hold on to. "I just want it to stop," he murmured. "I want to stop thinking about it every day." Elijah's heart ached. A deep, visceral pang for the boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast. "I know," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "What you've been through, it matters. It's going to make a difference. Even if you can't see it yet." Back inside, the prosecution summoned its next witness, a grizzled officer named Paul Tanner who'd shared the beat with Cooper for over a decade. His testimony was a thunderclap, shaking the room with its raw honesty. Tanner's broad shoulders slumped slightly as he spoke, his weathered face etched with regret. He painted a vivid picture of a brotherhood gone wrong, a culture where loyalty meant turning a blind eye, where protecting one of their own trumped the pursuit of justice. He recounted moments he'd witnessed Cooper's cruelty firsthand, a young man roughed up for no reason, a woman berated until she broke down in tears, all while others stood by, complicit in their silence. His voice wavered as he admitted his own shame, the guilt of having stayed quiet too long. His words were a damning indictment not just of Cooper, but of a system that had festered in its own corruption, failing the very people it swore to serve. As the trial wore on, Cooper's demeanor began to crack. The swagger that had once defined him, chest puffed, voice booming, dissolved into something smaller, more hollow. He sat slumped now, his eyes dull, his resignation palpable. Holloway fought valiantly to salvage his client's reputation, his arguments sharp and rehearsed, but the evidence loomed like a mountain too steep to climb. When Cooper finally took the stand, his testimony was a frantic scramble for redemption. He pointed fingers at colleagues, at superiors, at anyone he could drag down with him, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. But his excuses fell flat, a pathetic echo against the courage of those who dared to confront him. The prosecution's closing arguments came like a storm breaking. The lead attorney, a woman named Clara Evans, stood tall and composed, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes blazing with intellect and purpose. She laid out the case with surgical precision. Her voice steady as she recounted the toll of Cooper's actions, not just on Marcus and Alicia, but on a community left battered by his abuse of power. She spoke of the countless voices silenced over the years, the invisible wounds that festered in the shadows. Her words were both a condemnation and a rallying cry. A plea for accountability that struck a chord deep within the room. "This isn't just about one man," she said, her gaze sweeping the jury. "It's about a promise, to ensure no one else has to live in fear of those meant to protect them." When the jury retired to deliberate, the air grew thick with anticipation. A collective tension that seemed to press against the walls. Elijah sat with his wife Vanessa and Marcus, their hands intertwined, a fragile thread of unity in the face of uncertainty. The waiting stretched on, each tick of the clock a reminder of the stakes, their family's pain, the community's hope, the fragile chance for justice. Vanessa squeezed Elijah's hand. Her quiet strength a balm to his frayed nerves, while Marcus stared ahead, his young face lined with a weariness no child should know. At last, the jury returned. And the room fell into a hush so profound it felt sacred. The verdict rang out, guilty on multiple counts, a gross abuse of power laid bare for all to see. A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom, gasps of relief, stifled sobs, a quiet vindication for those who'd fought so hard. Cooper's head bowed, his fate sealed, while Holloway sat motionless. His defeat etched in the lines of his face. For Elijah, the triumph was bittersweet. The trial had stripped away Cooper's mask, but it had also exposed the rot beneath, a system flawed to its core. A battle far from won. Yet as he glanced at Marcus, a flicker of hope stirred within him. They'd stood their ground, and they'd shifted something, however small. Outside, the courthouse erupted into chaos and celebration. The crowd, protesters, families, strangers united by a shared demand for justice, cheered and wept as the news spread. Elijah stood with Vanessa and Marcus, his arm draped over his son's shoulders, facing the sea of faces that stretched before them. The setting sun bathed the city in gold. A quiet promise amid the noise. He thought of the pain that had brought them here, the anger that had fueled them, the resilience that had carried them through. The fight was far from over. But they were stronger now, forged in the fire of this moment. For the first time in weeks, Elijah let himself hope, not just for Marcus, but for a future where stories like his son's faded into memory. In the weeks that followed, life for the Freemans began to find a new cadence, one woven with healing and fragile optimism. Marcus returned to school, his steps lighter, a quiet pride blooming within him. The memories still lingered, sharp at the edges, but he drew strength from knowing his voice had ignited a spark. His classmates no longer whispered in hushed tones, instead, they approached him with admiration, some even joining him at community meetings, inspired by his stand. Vanessa channeled her relief into action, her warm resolve shining as she organized forums for parents, teaching them how to arm their children against a world that too often turned a blind eye. Her efforts rippled outward, knitting the community tighter, while Elijah pressed forward, tireless in his push for reform. New training programs emerged, accountability tightened. And conversations about systemic flaws gained traction, slow steps, but steps nonetheless. For Daniel Cooper, the fall was swift and merciless. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison, he faced the wreckage of his choices. Yet in a letter penned from his cell, later leaked to the press, he spoke of regret, of a wish to atone, a glimmer of humanity amid his ruin. Whether sincere or hollow, it underscored a truth: even the worst could change, if they dared to face themselves. The trial had not just judged one man, it had held a mirror to a community, forcing it to reckon with its own failures. And in that reckoning, there was power, a lesson in justice, in the cost of unchecked power, and in the enduring strength of those who rise to meet it. In a world once fractured by protests, where shouts of anger and division had echoed through the streets, something remarkable began to stir. The chaos that had torn neighbors apart slowly gave way to a newfound sense of unity. People who had once stood on opposite sides of picket lines now linked arms, their voices rising together in a chorus that demanded more from those in power. It was a slow, messy transformation, but it was real. New initiatives sprouted like fragile seedlings pushing through cracked pavement, programs designed to mend the gaping rift between law enforcement and the communities they were meant to protect. These weren't grand, sweeping fixes, they were small, deliberate spaces carved out for conversation, for listening, for the kind of understanding that doesn't come easy. Progress crept along at a snail's pace, and perfection remained a distant dream, but the air itself felt different, lighter, charged with a quiet hope that hadn't been there before. For Marcus Freeman, this journey was more than a fight for justice, it was a quest to unearth the voice he'd never known he had. Months after the trial that had shaken his family to its core, an unexpected invitation arrived, a chance to speak at a youth leadership conference. At first, he recoiled from the idea. The thought of standing on a stage, hundreds of eyes fixed on him, sent a shiver of dread down his spine. His palms grew sweaty, his throat tight, as he imagined his words faltering in the spotlight. But then, like a lifeline, his father's voice broke through the noise in his mind. Every step forward matters, no matter how small. Those words had carried him through darker days, and now they steadied him again. He pictured his father's weathered hands resting on his shoulders, the quiet strength in his gaze. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped onto the stage, the wooden floor creaking faintly beneath his sneakers. The crowd stretched out before him, a sea of faces blurring into one another, and for a moment, he felt that old, suffocating sense of powerlessness creeping back, the weight of a chain that had once bound him, both literally and figuratively. But he pushed past it. His voice trembled at first, then grew steady as he spoke of that chain, the cold metal that had bitten into his skin, a symbol of a day when the world had seemed to strip him bare. He told them about the moment he'd felt utterly helpless, a teenage boy caught in a system that didn't see him as human. And then the turning point, the day he'd clawed his dignity back from the ashes of that despair. His words poured out, raw and unpolished, but they struck a chord. The audience leaned in, hanging on every syllable, and when he finished, the room erupted. Applause crashed over him like a wave, loud and unrelenting, filling the hollow spaces fear had carved inside him. Marcus stood there, chest heaving, a shy smile tugging at his lips. This wasn't just a speech, it was a piece of his soul laid bare, a moment he'd carry like a torch for the rest of his life. Proof, at last, that his story could light a fire in others. In the audience, Elijah and Vanessa Freeman watched their son with glistening eyes. Elijah, a man whose broad shoulders had borne the weight of too many battles, felt his heart swell until it threatened to burst. Seeing Marcus up there, tall, defiant, alive, was a living testament to why he'd fought so fiercely. It wasn't just about tearing down a rotting system riddled with corruption, it was about building something better. A world where his son could stand tall without the shadow of fear lurking behind him. Every sleepless night, every shouted argument with officials, every tear shed in frustration, it had all led to this. Beside him, Vanessa squeezed his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She'd always been the quieter strength in their family, the one who stitched them back together when the world tried to pull them apart. Now, watching Marcus shine, she felt a pride so deep it ached, a mother's pride, fierce and unshakable. She remembered the nights she'd sat up with him, wiping tears from his cheeks after the arrest, whispering that he was enough, that he was more than what they'd tried to make him. As the family stepped out of the conference hall into the crisp evening air, the sky streaked with hues of orange and purple, Marcus turned to his parents. His face, still flushed from the adrenaline of the stage, softened into a grin. "Thank you, he said, his voice low but steady. Those 2 words carried everything: gratitude for their unwavering support. For the sacrifices they'd made, for the love that had pulled him through. Elijah clapped a hand on his shoulder, and Vanessa pulled him into a hug, her arms wrapping around him like a shield. No more needed to be said. The moment hung between them, warm and solid, a quiet victory after so much storm. Their fight had never been just about them. The Freeman's struggle rippled outward, touching lives they'd never meet. In the neighborhood, people whispered their story over cups of coffee at the diner, their voices a mix of awe and determination. There was Mrs. Carter, the elderly widow who'd lived 3 houses down for decades, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun as she sat on her porch each evening. She'd seen the protests unfold, had watched Marcus grow from a scrappy kid chasing a soccer ball to a young man with a voice that roared. Now, she nodded approvingly whenever his name came up, her wrinkled hands folding a newspaper as she murmured, "That boy's got guts." Then there was Jamal, the local barber, who'd started clipping hair for free at community events after hearing Marcus speak, his laughter booming as he told customers, "If the Freemans can stand up, so can we." Their story became a spark, igniting small acts of defiance and solidarity across the city. The road ahead wasn't smooth, cracks still lined its surface, and shadows loomed on the horizon. But the Freemans faced it as they always had, together. Elijah would sometimes sit on the front steps late at night, staring at the stars, his mind replaying the years of struggle. Vanessa would join him, a blanket draped over her shoulders, and they'd talk about the little things, the way Marcus had started humming again, a habit he'd lost after that awful day. Those moments, small as they were, stitched their family tighter, made them stronger than the forces that had tried to break them. Marcus, too, carried the weight of their legacy. He'd walk past the old basketball court where he'd once played with friends, the chain-link fence rattling in the wind, and feel a pang of memory. But it no longer crushed him. Instead, it fueled him. He'd stop by the community center some afternoons, chatting with kids who looked up to him now, their eyes wide as he told them they could fight, too, that their voices mattered. One boy, a wiry 10-year-old named Tyrell, always lingered after the others left, kicking at the dirt with his scuffed sneakers. "You really think we can change stuff?" he'd ask, his voice small but curious. Marcus would crouch down, meeting his gaze. "I know we can," he'd say, and Tyrell would nod, a flicker of belief taking root. This wasn't just a story of survival, it was a lesson carved in sweat and tears. Justice, the Freemans showed, isn't a gift handed down from on high, it's a flame you tend. A battle you wage even when your hands shake. And power? When it's abused, when it's wielded to crush instead of lift, the consequences ripple far beyond the moment. The corrupt officers who'd once smirked behind their badges, the officials who'd turned a blind eye, they hadn't just hurt Marcus, they'd sown the seeds of their own undoing. The community's awakening, the programs, the unity, it all traced back to that single, reckless act of overreach. The Freeman's courage had turned a mirror on the powerful, forcing them to face the cost of their arrogance. Their journey whispers a challenge to anyone listening: one voice, one step, one defiant stand can shift the tide. It's not quick, and it's rarely easy, but it's worth it. The Freemans didn't just endure, they transformed pain into purpose, proving that even in the darkest corners, light can break through. And as their story echoes on, it's a reminder that justice isn't a destination, it's a fire we all have a hand in keeping alive.